out of the way now?
I mean, a little bit.
Yeah, that's okay.
All right. Seymour it is.
So both the mountains we tried this morning, Seymour and Cypress, are both closed. Not sure if that's new COVID regulations or whatever. They say they're not opening until 7 a.m. So we're gonna go try a third option and hopefully we get lucky.
Deep Cove, you go up to Quarry Rock.
What's that?
So the other day, I managed to convince Rich to get up at 3 a.m. and drive out to the mountains with me so we could test out the Sony FX3 in the dark. It didn't work out.
Don't ask me why we're doing this when we don't have to. Seemed like a good idea last night, but now it sucks. Alright, so it's almost 4 o'clock in the morning. Alright, I'll be here soon. I'm just trying to get a couple cups of coffee in before we start this FX3 night mission. And I've already shot a bunch of test stuff in my apartment and walking around the city, but I thought a more real world example would be useful. So we're gonna head up Mount Seymour and see what this thing can do lit only by headlamps. Sunrise missions are always a battle. Every time I do it, I wonder why. But every time I'm up and moving and I get that sunrise, I'm always glad I did. So just do yourself a favor. Get over that first 20 minutes of horribleness and hopefully there's some nice light at the end of it. Or if you live in BC like we do, you'll get to the top and it'll just be a gray overcast day. But you'll still be happy you went. Dude.
Morning!
Before we get too much farther, I just want to acknowledge how awesome it is that we're using a smart car as our expedition vehicle. Before everyone in the comments lights us up, I know we're in a smart car, and yes, it's the best. Minor hurdle, the first mountain we tried was closed, so we're going to turn around and try another one. The good thing about BC is there's always another mountain. So now we've been driving around for an hour, so much that we're almost out of gas, and both the mountains we've tried have been closed. So we're going to go out to a kind of more chill tourist lookout and just hope we can get a nice enough sunrise to make it worth it.
Gas prices are brutal. Like 167 versus 142.
Huge.
You can head up to Quarry Rock. So it's a super touristy area in the daytime, but there'll be no one there now, so that might be an option.
Let's do it.
Last time I was on Mount Seymour, there was a bear that ran right across the path. I regretted not having the bear spray. You just think when there's so many people that the bears are going to avoid you. Well, they're probably just so conditioned nowadays to be pretty chill about that. You want a sandwich? Okay, it says no access to Quarry Rock beyond this point. That's us there. And that's where we want to get to. Looks like there's another way if we go from this marina down here. We have to kind of follow this residential road for 10 minutes.
So there's no light at all. The camera seems to be doing a lot better than my eyes, but the autofocus is hunting quite a bit, which I guess is normal in pitch black, but once I put the headlight on, I sort of thought it would lock onto my face, but I'm not really sure if it is. We'll just have to see when I get back how it looks. But brightness wise, shooting at 12,800 right now, and it looks great. So it's about 6 a.m. now, and definitely getting a bit lighter. Still, the autofocus is struggling a little bit. Wasn't really expecting that. I guess it's better than any autofocus system I've ever used before, but I was kind of hoping it would just see in the dark and be perfect, and it's not quite that. Okay, all right, now the autofocus seems to be doing its job. And actually, it's still pretty dark out here, but in the screen it looks like it's almost broad daylight, so I'm pretty impressed. Alright, so we made it. Not quite the extreme mountain adventure we were planning, but it was good to get the camera out in the dark and see how it worked. Overall, pretty impressive. Not perfect. You know, I was kind of hoping that it would be like the best thing ever and it would just work like magic. And it worked really well, but there's a few minor issues that I think I noticed, and once I have a chance to get it on my computer and have a look at the footage, I think I'm going to see a lot of out of focus shots, but we'll just have to wait and see. Hey guys, Editor Luke here. Just one quick thing before I get to the rest of my thoughts on this camera. I noticed I clipped the audio in a bunch of places for the next part of the video, and I'm normally pretty conservative and I only had it set to 60%, but somehow I blew right through the limiter. I was just talking in a normal voice and not filming anything extreme, so I was a little bit surprised. Sony says this camera has an always-on built-in limiter, but I somehow managed to blow straight through it, talking in a normal voice indoors. And this is something that only normally happens to me when I'm filming something extremely loud, like a marching band or a drag race or something. So I guess it's not really much of a limiter. It's totally my fault. I should have been paying closer attention to it. But it's something to be aware of if you're going to be filming with this camera. Even though there is a limiter, it's really not much of a limiter because you can go over it easily. Okay, enough of that. Back to the video. Alright, I'm home now, and after taking not one, but 2 separate naps to recover from waking up in the middle of the night, I managed to get the footage ingested.
Overall, my first impression is really solid. There were some things I loved about this camera and a few other things I didn't like so much. In general though, this is an amazing little camera and it's going to open up a ton of possibilities both in my professional work and for YouTube. First off, I should just say that I didn't really design this test to get the most possible image quality out of the camera. I'm sure if I'd set up lights and put it on a tripod, I could have squeezed every extra ounce of dynamic range out of it and all that kind of stuff. But that wasn't really the point of this test. The goal was really more to see how the camera handled and where it struggled so that I knew what to expect out of it when there was real pressure to get a shot. So this test was really set up to reflect those less than ideal shooting conditions that I most often work in. The first thing I need to get out of the way is how impressed I am with the low light performance. I shot this whole thing at ISO 12,800, and that might be old news to people who have had A7S3s for a while, but for me, coming from an FS7 where I rarely go above ISO 2000, it's a whole new world. A lot of the time, the camera saw way better than I was seeing with my eyes, and for me, that's incredible. I only used one lens for 95% of these shots, and that's a 16-35 f2.8. I know I could have gotten even more low light performance by using a prime lens, but again, I wanted to mimic a situation where I didn't have time to constantly change lenses, so I just stuck with one lens. I also should apologize for the headlamp flicker in a couple of shots. I actually knew this particular headlamp was really bad for flicker. I took it on a trip with me to Kenya where we were crawling around in a bunch of bat caves in the dark, and it flickered like crazy and nearly drove me insane. But the FS7 has an electronic shutter control where you can kind of adjust the phase of the camera. I don't know how it works, but it gets rid of the flicker, let's say that. This camera doesn't have it, and I tried experimenting with bumping the shutter speed a little bit, but it didn't seem to work, so we just have to deal with it. If anybody knows of a way to get rid of flicker in post, please let me know. But a good lesson is that if you're ever going to be shooting adventure type content where a lot of people are going to be wearing headlamps, test out the headlamps first, find one that works and doesn't flicker, and then make sure everyone has the same one. There's nothing worse than having 9 people in a dark space and one of the lamps is flickering and you can't figure out which it is. So what did I like and what was not so great about this camera? Well, like I already said, the low light performance and the ability to shoot relatively noise-free S-Log at ISO 12,800 is a huge selling point and really probably why most people are buying this camera. The other thing that's no surprise is I love the form factor. To have a full frame camera in a package this small that has this kind of low light performance really opens up a bunch of extra possibilities. For most verite shooting, I would still definitely prefer to have an FX9 or an FS7 or a shoulder mounted camera, but this means for things like gimbals and mounting on cars and in tight spaces, I can get a really great looking image. I also have really high hopes for Sony's AirPeak drone system. I'm guessing that that's what these weird unusable mounting points on the side of the camera are for. And if it works well, it could be a huge game changer. Right now for high-end dock work, the DJI Inspire 2 is really the standard. And as great as that camera is, I don't think there's any way that it could compete with this thing hanging off the bottom of a drone. If you paired this or an A7S III with a good lens on a drone, I think you would get an amazing picture and it could really shake up the aerial cinematography world. I also don't really love DJI as a company. I think they do a bunch of scummy things like change the shape of their batteries from model to model to make sure that you can't keep using the same ones when you upgrade your drone. Just seems like it unnecessarily generates a ton of waste and is kind of a greedy corporate type move in my eyes. So any new players in the drone space would be really welcome for me. So Sony, please nail the AirPeak. If I can use this camera instead of the DJI ones as my new drone cam, you will absolutely be getting my money. Something I really wasn't expecting to like about this camera was the battery performance. I think the last mirrorless Sony camera that I used on a big shoot was the A7S II, which used the old batteries, and we were constantly running out of power. With this thing, I used the same battery for the entire 3 hours of hiking. I bought 4 batteries, and initially I was kind of worried it wouldn't be enough, but I'm pretty sure that's going to cover me in almost every type of shooting situation, except for a really long interview. I also thought the autofocus was amazing, but only in good light. In good light, it grabbed a hold of my eye and just didn't let go. It was pretty much perfect. That's a big reason why I bought this camera, to use as a B cam for interviews, where I can just set the autofocus and trust it to hold focus so I don't have to monitor it. And I'm glad to see that under good lighting conditions, it did that job really well. But that's a good segue into something I didn't like so much, which was the ultra low light autofocus performance. For the first half of the morning, the camera was struggling pretty consistently to find autofocus. Now granted, it was incredibly low light, and it's probably not fair to expect any camera to be able to work under those conditions, but I sort of hoped it would. There were a couple times where I had a headlamp pointing right down at my face, and I really thought that the camera should have been able to find its focus, and it just didn't. It wasn't until after 6:30, when the sun was already up and we didn't actually need the headlamps anymore, that it was reliably locking onto my face. Now there's probably no camera out there that could have autofocused better in those conditions, and like I said earlier, it's still the best autofocus I've ever used, but I definitely can't trust it in super low light situations. Now that's a real shame, because normally I would just switch to manual focus, but the viewfinder is so small on the FX3 that even with peaking set to maximum, I'm never quite sure when I've locked onto focus. I'm definitely no stranger to manual focus. In fact, the two lenses I use the most on my doc shoots are the Fujinon MK Cinema Primes, which are manual focus only. But when I use them on my FS7, I have either a small HD monitor or a Zacuto Gradical Eye to help me get focus. And on the tiny FX3 screen, I just wasn't able to do it consistently. Maybe I just need more practice. My first impression is that it's kind of tough. I know that I could mount a monitor onto it, and that would probably make things easier, but it really changes the ergonomics of the camera. And for something like a hike where you're trying to keep weight down, I just didn't want that huge built-out package hanging off my neck. To me, this is a camera that's designed to be at its best when using the autofocus. So under good lighting conditions, I have total confidence in it, but because of how much it struggled in low light, I just won't be able to use it as a reliable A camera. The last kind of shocker for me is how clunky these files are to work with in post. I know this is probably not news to people who've been shooting with mirrorless cameras for a long time, but H.264 is a grind on my computer. I've got a fully spec'd out 16-inch MacBook Pro, and it handles the 4K footage from my FS7 no problem. It's totally smooth. But as I started to lay out the timeline for this video, it is struggling big time. I'm shooting in 4K medium quality right now, and I know that supposedly the higher quality setting is a little bit easier for the editing program to read, but it's just not worth the trade-off in huge file size for me. I know I can also use proxies, and that might be something I explore going forward, but all I can say right now, my first impression, is that this thing destroys my computer. Apart from these few things, which are more like annoyances rather than real problems, I really like this camera. I don't have buyer's remorse, which is awesome, and I can already see the ways that this is going to boost my production value. I can see a bunch of situations where the FX6 would also be a much better choice than this, just for the ergonomics and the ability to attach monitors without destroying the form factor. I mean, in a perfect world, you really want all three. You want the FX9, the FX6, and then this one, the FX3. You want to pick and choose which one is the best for each particular situation, and they're all kind of designed to work together in a, an ecosystem. If I could, I'd get all three, and I'm sure that's exactly what Sony wants. But right now, it's just not in the budget. As always, I'm glad I dragged myself out of bed for this one. If anyone has any ideas on things I'm doing wrong or ways that I can make this camera work better for me, let me know in the comments down below. See ya.